A petite literature student walking across a Vienna University campus, backpack slung over her shoulder, looking like she's headed to study Victorian poetry. Her professors see a quiet academic. Her roommates see someone who takes yoga way too seriously. University security sees a potential problem student with concerning behavioral patterns. But what none of them realize is that hidden in that innocent-looking backpack are items that would make a special forces operator take notice. Modified equipment, tactical communication devices, and defensive tools that this unassuming young woman has spent 2 years carefully acquiring and learning to use. Her name is Hailey Williams, and today she's about to discover that all her excessive preparation wasn't paranoid after all. Because in less than 3 hours, she'll be the only person standing between a fellow student and a professional kidnapping operation that has already claimed victims across 3 countries. This is the story of how someone who looked like any college student proved that the most dangerous assumption is underestimating the person sitting quietly in the back of the room. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. Hailey Williams blended into the University of Vienna campus like morning mist against ancient stone buildings. At 22, she stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, with auburn hair typically pulled back in a practical ponytail, and clothes chosen for function rather than fashion. To her professors, she was the earnest literature student who sat in the 3rd row, took meticulous notes, and wrote thoughtful essays that occasionally worried them with their focus on themes of survival and conflict. Her dorm mates at Studenheim Schlossbergas were the responsible one who never seemed to sleep past 6 a.m., maintained an exercise schedule that bordered on obsessive, and carried a backpack that seemed disproportionately heavy for someone studying 19th century literature. They'd nicknamed her Mouse during freshman year, though never maliciously. She was simply the kind of person who moved quietly through spaces, fixed problems without fanfare, and seemed to notice things that escaped everyone else's attention. What none of them understood was that Hailey's quiet competence extended far beyond academic work. While her roommates struggled to remember their class schedules, Hailey had memorized the security protocols for every building on campus. While her professors focused on her literary analysis, she was simultaneously conducting detailed assessments of evacuation routes, communication systems, and potential vulnerabilities in their learning environment. Her academic advisor, Dr. Schneider, had noted during their first semester meeting that Hailey seemed unusually focused on practical applications of theoretical knowledge. Your essay on Conrad's Heart of Darkness included surprisingly sophisticated analysis of colonial security operations, she'd observed. Most literature students don't research actual military tactics when analyzing fictional narratives. Hailey had responded with the careful deflection she'd perfected over months of similar conversations. I believe understanding historical context enhances literary interpretation. Conrad drew from real experiences, so understanding those experiences helps decode his artistic choices. It was a reasonable explanation that satisfied Dr. Schneider while concealing the deeper truth. Hailey's research into military tactics wasn't motivated by academic curiosity, but systematic preparation for threats that others couldn't imagine needing to address. The pattern repeated itself across all aspects of her university life. Her physical fitness routine, which dorm mates attributed to dedication to health, actually represented tactical conditioning designed to meet specific performance standards. Her language studies, officially focused on German and French for literature research, included technical vocabulary related to security operations and emergency procedures. Even her choice of dormitory had been based on detailed analysis of building security, evacuation routes, and proximity to both campus resources and city emergency services. Professor Mueller, who taught her Victorian literature seminar, had grown increasingly concerned about what he perceived as Hailey's unusual interpretive approach. Miss Williams, your analysis consistently emphasizes defensive strategies and threat assessment in texts that most scholars approach through entirely different frameworks. Your paper on Dracula read more like a tactical assessment than literary criticism. Hailey had learned to manage these conversations with academic explanations that satisfied surface curiosity while protecting the operational security she'd spent months developing. Gothic literature reflects the anxieties of its time period, she'd replied. Stoker was writing during a period of significant social and political instability. Understanding the security concerns of late Victorian society provides insight into the psychological foundations of the horror he created. Every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 a.m., while her roommates at the University of Vienna were still deep in sleep, Hailey Williams slipped out of her dormitory and made her way to an unmarked building 15 minutes from campus. The early morning streets were empty, except for the occasional delivery truck, and the crisp Austrian air carried the scent of fresh bread from nearby bakeries. To anyone who might have noticed her, she looked like any other dedicated student heading to an early study session. The building housed Tactical Defense Systems, a specialized training facility that catered to security professionals, law enforcement, and military personnel. Hailey had discovered it during her first semester when she'd been researching self-defense classes after a string of incidents targeting female students in the area. What started as basic personal protection training had evolved into something far more comprehensive. Under the tutelage of Marcus Weber, a former Austrian Special Forces operator turned civilian instructor, Hailey had spent the past 2 years developing skills that would have surprised anyone who knew her as the quiet literature student who preferred books to parties. Weber had initially been skeptical of the petite 20-year-old who spoke softly and seemed more comfortable discussing Kafka than combat techniques. But Hailey's dedication and natural aptitude had quickly changed his perspective. "Most people come here thinking they want to learn to fight," Weber had told her during one of their early sessions. "You came here to learn to survive. There's a difference." He'd recognized something in Hailey that she was only beginning to understand herself. A methodical approach to preparation that went far beyond casual interest in self-defense. Hailey's training regimen was exhaustive and systematic. She'd mastered hand-to-hand combat techniques from multiple disciplines, learned to handle various weapons with precision, and studied tactical response strategies that most civilians never considered. But perhaps more importantly, she developed what Weber called situational architecture, the ability to read environments, identify potential threats, and plan responses before danger materialized. Her backpack, a seemingly ordinary student accessory in muted gray canvas, had been carefully modified over months of preparation. Hidden compartments contained items that looked innocuous to casual inspection but served specific tactical purposes. A titanium pen that could function as a striking weapon, a reinforced water bottle that concealed emergency supplies, cable ties disguised as hair accessories. Each item had been selected for dual purpose, allowing her to carry defensive tools without attracting attention. The most sophisticated modification was a false bottom that contained communication equipment and defensive items that would have been impossible to explain if discovered. But Hailey's careful planning meant the discovery was unlikely. She'd studied bag inspection procedures, understood how security personnel assessed threats, and designed her concealment accordingly. Her academic schedule provided perfect cover for her training. While other students spent mornings recovering from late nights or sleeping in, Hailey used the time for physical conditioning and skills practice. Her literature coursework, which required extensive research and writing, gave her legitimate reasons to carry a heavy backpack and spend long hours in various locations around the city. She'd also cultivated knowledge that complemented her physical training: urban geography, emergency medical procedures, communication protocols, even basic explosive ordnance recognition. Skills that Weber insisted were as important as combat techniques. "Fighting is the last option," he'd repeatedly emphasized. "Awareness and avoidance are your primary weapons." Nobody at the university knew about her training. Her roommates saw her as studious and responsible, but unremarkable. Her professors appreciated her thoughtful analysis of literature, but had no reason to suspect she spent equal time analyzing tactical scenarios. Even her closest friends viewed her early morning routine as admirable dedication to fitness, never questioning why she needed such an extensive gym bag for what she claimed were yoga sessions. The secrecy wasn't born from shame or deception, but from practicality. Hailey understood that her preparation would be viewed as excessive, even paranoid, by people who lived in the comfortable assumption that serious threats were unlikely. She learned early in her training that people who couldn't imagine needing such skills often became uncomfortable around those who possessed them. Part 4. Present, Casual Dismissal. The dismissal started subtly, the way these things usually do. At first, it was just gentle teasing from her roommates about her rigid schedule and early morning disappearances. Emma, her closest friend since freshman year, would joke about Hailey's mysterious morning adventures while struggling to make her own 10 a.m. classes. "You're like a robot, Hailey. Normal people don't wake up at 5:30 a.m. by choice." The teasing became more pointed when Hailey declined social invitations that conflicted with her training schedule. Her dorm mates began to see her dedication as antisocial rather than admirable. "Come on, one late night won't kill you," became a constant refrain when she refused to join impromptu parties or last-minute bar crawls. They couldn't understand why someone would prioritize mysterious early morning activities over the social experiences that defined university life. The dismissal started subtly, the way these things usually do. At first, it was just gentle teasing from her roommates about her rigid schedule and early morning disappearances. Emma, her closest friend since freshman year, would joke about Hailey's mysterious morning adventures while struggling to make her own 10 a.m. classes. "You're like a robot, Hailey," she'd say with affectionate exasperation. "Normal people don't wake up at 5:30 a.m. by choice." The teasing became more pointed when Hailey declined social invitations that conflicted with her training schedule. Her dorm mates began to see her dedication as antisocial rather than admirable. "Come on, one late night won't kill you," became a constant refrain when she refused to join impromptu parties or last-minute bar crawls. They couldn't understand why someone would prioritize mysterious early morning activities over the social experiences that defined university life. Professor Mueller, her Victorian literature instructor, expressed concern during office hours about what he perceived as Hailey's excessive focus on themes of danger and survival in her essays. "Your analysis of Gothic literature consistently emphasizes threat assessment and defensive strategies," he'd observed, reviewing her latest paper on Dracula. "While insightful, I wonder if you might benefit from exploring more varied interpretive frameworks. Literature isn't always about survival." The casual dismissal extended to her physical capabilities. When the subject of safety came up in dormitory conversations, usually sparked by news reports of incidents around the city, Hailey's roommates would automatically exclude her from discussions of self-defense. "Hailey's too sweet to hurt anyone," Emma would declare. "She'd probably apologize to a mugger for being in their way." The comments were meant affectionately, but they revealed assumptions about her capabilities that went far beyond her appearance. When a women's safety workshop organized by the university, Hailey had volunteered to help demonstrate basic escape techniques. The instructor, a local martial arts teacher, had initially paired her with other small participants, assuming she'd need extra guidance. When Hailey executed the techniques with precision that surprised everyone present, the instructor awkwardly praised her natural instincts, while clearly being unsure how someone so unassuming had developed such skills. The most telling dismissal came during conversations about current events. When news broke about various security incidents around Europe, Hailey's dorm mates would discuss them with a mixture of concern and detachment, the way people talk about problems they assume won't affect them personally. If Hailey offered insights into security procedures or threat assessment, her comments were received politely but dismissed as theoretical knowledge gained from too much reading. "You watch too many spy movies," became Emma's standard response when Hailey noticed things others missed. When she pointed out that their dormitory security protocols had obvious vulnerabilities, or when she mentioned that certain areas of the city had patterns of incidents that suggested organized activity, her observations were labeled paranoid rather than perceptive. The cultural context amplified the dismissal. Vienna prided itself on being a safe, civilized city where serious threats were rare and violence was generally confined to distant news reports. Students, particularly those from comfortable backgrounds, lived with an assumption of safety that made Hailey's level of preparation seem not just unnecessary, but almost neurotic. Her academic advisor, Dr. Schneider, had suggested during their semester review that Hailey might benefit from joining more social activities. Your grades are excellent, but university is about more than academic achievement. Personal development includes learning to relax and trust your environment. You seem to carry tension that might be relieved through more typical student experiences. Even Weber, her instructor, occasionally expressed concern about the intensity of her preparation. Skills are tools, he'd remind her during particularly focused training sessions, but tools shouldn't define the person carrying them. Make sure you're not losing sight of normal life while preparing for abnormal situations. The dismissal wasn't malicious, but it was complete. Everyone in Hailey's life had unconsciously categorized her as someone who thought too much, prepared too extensively, and took precautions that were admirable in principle but unnecessary in practice. They saw her as a careful, responsible student whose only notable characteristic was an unusual dedication to fitness and an interesting tendency to analyze literature through unconventional perspectives. Nobody questioned why her backpack was always heavy, why she chose routes around the city that others found unnecessarily complex, or why she seemed to notice details that escaped everyone else's attention. They'd created an image of Hailey that was comfortable and safe, one that allowed them to maintain their own assumptions about the world while affectionately tolerating her quirks. The shift from casual dismissal to genuine concern began 3 weeks before everything changed. Dr. Schneider had called Hailey into her office for what she described as a wellness check, her tone carrying the careful neutrality that administrative personnel used when addressing potentially sensitive issues. "Hailey, several of your instructors have expressed concern about some patterns they've noticed in your coursework," Dr. Schneider began, consulting a file that seemed uncomfortably thick for a routine meeting. "Your essays consistently focus on themes of conflict, surveillance, and tactical thinking. Your research papers frequently reference security protocols and threat assessment methodologies that seem outside the scope of your literature studies." Hailey had felt her stomach tighten, recognizing the shift in tone that meant her careful balance was beginning to fail. "I've always been interested in how external pressures influence narrative structure," she'd replied carefully. "Literature often reflects the security concerns of its time period." "Yes, but you're applying contemporary security analysis to historical texts in ways that suggest familiarity with modern tactical thinking," Dr. Schneider continued. "Your recent paper on espionage themes in Conrad's work included references to operational security procedures that most literature students wouldn't know. Where are you getting this information?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Hailey realized that her attempts to integrate her tactical knowledge with her academic work had created a pattern that was drawing unwanted attention. "I do extensive research," she had said. "I believe in understanding subjects thoroughly." But Dr. Schneider's expression suggested that this explanation wasn't sufficient. "Hailey, we also understand that you maintain an unusually rigid schedule that includes activities you haven't fully disclosed to residential staff. Your roommates have mentioned that you carry equipment they can't identify, and that you seem to have knowledge about campus security that goes beyond what's available to students." The meeting ended with what Dr. Schneider called recommendations, but felt like directives. Hailey should consider speaking with a counselor about stress management. She should diversify her academic interests to include more conventional approaches to literature. She should be more transparent with residential staff about her daily activities. The aftermath was worse than the meeting itself. Word spread through the informal networks that connected staff, faculty, and student services. Suddenly, Hailey noticed people watching her more carefully.
Her literature professors began questioning her interpretations more aggressively, as if looking for signs of whatever had triggered the administrative concern. Professor Mueller had been particularly pointed during a seminar discussion of Hemingway's war stories. When Hailey offered analysis of the tactical realism in the combat descriptions, he had interrupted with unusual sharpness. "Miss Williams, your consistent focus on military accuracy in fictional scenarios is becoming concerning. Literature isn't a manual for actual combat operations." The suspicion spread to her living situation. Emma, who had always teased Hailey about her mysterious morning routine, began asking more direct questions. "Where exactly do you go every morning? And why won't you ever let anyone come with you?" The questions carried an edge that hadn't been there before, as if Emma was trying to solve a puzzle that had been bothering her for months. Her other roommates began paying attention to details they'd previously ignored. The weight of her backpack, the way she checked locks and windows before leaving, her habit of choosing seats that gave her clear views of exits. Behaviors that had once seemed quirky now appeared potentially problematic. The most damaging development was when university security began to take notice. Officer Hartman, the senior security coordinator, had stopped her after a late evening study session to ask about her security awareness activities. "Students have mentioned that you seem very knowledgeable about our protocols, perhaps too knowledgeable. Are you conducting some kind of unauthorized security assessment?" Hailey realized that her careful preparation was being reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion rather than admiration. Her knowledge of campus vulnerabilities, which she developed for personal safety, was being viewed as potentially threatening. Her physical conditioning and tactical awareness were being seen as excessive rather than prudent. The cultural context made everything worse. In a city that prided itself on civilized safety, someone who prepared for violence seemed almost subversive. Her fellow students began to wonder if her caution implied knowledge of threats they should be worried about, or if it suggested she might pose a threat herself. Weber had warned her during one of their training sessions that this might happen. People who can't imagine needing protection often become suspicious of those who seek it. They start to wonder if you know something they don't, or if you're creating the problems you're preparing for. The investigation became more formal when Dr. Schneider requested a meeting with both Hailey and her parents. "We're concerned about behavioral patterns that suggest Hailey may be experiencing stress or anxiety that's manifesting in excessive preoccupation with security and threat assessment," she explained over a video call that felt like an intervention. Hailey's parents, comfortable academics who lived in the assumption that their daughter's biggest challenges would be maintaining good grades and finding suitable career opportunities, were confused and concerned. They couldn't understand why their responsible, studious daughter was being viewed as a potential problem by university administration. The meeting ended with an agreement that Hailey would scale back her extracurricular security interests and focus more intensively on conventional academic and social activities. She was also required to meet weekly with a counselor to address what Dr. Schneider termed hypervigilance patterns that may be interfering with normal student development. The morning of October 15th started with the same routine that had defined Hailey's university experience for 2 years. She woke at 5:30 a.m., carefully packed her modified backpack, and slipped out of the dormitory for what she told her increasingly suspicious roommates was a yoga session. The Vienna streets were crisp with early autumn air, and the sun was just beginning to paint the historic buildings with golden light. But this Tuesday was different in ways that wouldn't become apparent until later, as Hailey made her way toward the city center for a research session at the Austrian National Library. 3 separate groups of men were conducting surveillance on university students, looking for specific targets that matched a detailed profile: young, isolated, from wealthy families with patterns of movement that made them vulnerable to coordinated action. Hailey had chosen the library for her morning research specifically because it required a route through Stadtpark, one of Vienna's most beautiful green spaces. The path through the park was longer than the direct route, but it gave her opportunities to practice the situational awareness techniques Weber had drilled into her. She'd scan for anomalies, identify potential threat indicators, and plan multiple exit routes as she walked. At 8:47 a.m., as she settled into her favorite reading alcove on the library's third floor, Hailey noticed 3 men enter the main reading room. They carried books and notebooks like typical researchers, but their positioning and movement patterns triggered recognition protocols she'd learned to trust. They were conducting surveillance, establishing sightlines, and coordinating through subtle signals that most people wouldn't notice. Hailey continued her research while monitoring their activities peripherally. Over the next 90 minutes, she observed them systematically cataloging the students present, noting who was alone, who appeared distracted, and who followed predictable patterns. When they began focusing on a group of young women studying near the periodical section, Hailey's training kicked into full awareness mode. At 10:15 a.m., she watched one of the men approach Sarah Chen, a fellow literature student who often studied alone and had mentioned during class discussions that her parents were successful business owners in Hong Kong. The conversation appeared casual, but Hailey recognized the information-gathering techniques Weber had taught her to identify. The man was building a profile, establishing Sarah's routine, and testing her responses to unexpected social interaction. Hailey made a decision that would have surprised everyone who knew her as the cautious, rule-following student. She activated the discreet recording device hidden in her modified pen and began documenting the surveillance operation. If this was what she suspected, evidence would be crucial for any official response. By 11:30 a.m., the pattern had become unmistakable. The 3 men were part of a coordinated operation targeting specific students. Sarah was their primary focus, but they were also monitoring 2 other young women who fit similar profiles. When Sarah packed her materials and left the library, 2 of the men followed at a discreet distance, while the third remained to continue surveillance on the remaining targets. Hailey faced a choice that crystallized everything she'd been preparing for. She could report her observations to library security or university authorities, but by the time they processed her concerns and decided on appropriate action, Sarah would likely be beyond help. Or she could use her training to follow the surveillance operation and intervene if necessary. The decision was complicated by her recent meetings with university administration. Any action that drew attention to her tactical knowledge would confirm their suspicions about her excessive preparation. If she was wrong about the threat, her intervention would be seen as paranoid vigilante behavior that justified their concerns about her mental state. But if she was right, and if she did nothing, Sarah Chen would disappear into a criminal operation that targeted young women whose families could afford to pay for their return. At 11:45 a.m., Hailey packed her materials and began following the followers, using techniques Weber had taught her for urban tracking. She maintained distance, used reflective surfaces to monitor multiple targets, and planned her route to provide maximum flexibility for response options. The surveillance led through Vienna's tourist district, where the crowds provided excellent cover for both the criminals and Hailey's counter-surveillance. But she noticed that they were moving Sarah toward areas that became progressively more isolated, away from the commercial centers where help would be readily available. By 12:30 p.m., the operation had moved to the edges of Prater Park, where the seasonal crowds had thinned and the paths became less populated. Hailey realized that this was where the surveillance would transition to action. The men had chosen their location carefully, somewhere with enough space to operate but insufficient witness presence to complicate their plan. She was now close enough to hear fragments of radio communication between the operatives. They were coordinating a pickup operation, discussing timing and extraction routes in language that confirmed her worst assessment of the situation. Sarah Chen was walking into a kidnapping operation, and Hailey was the only person in position to prevent it. At 12:43 p.m., as Sarah walked deeper into the isolated section of the park, obviously unaware of the danger closing around her, Hailey made the choice that would transform her from suspected paranoid student to someone whose preparation had been absolutely necessary. She reached into her backpack and began accessing the equipment that university administrators thought was evidence of psychological problems.
equipment that was about to prove the difference between Sarah Chen making it home safely and disappearing into a criminal network that targeted young women whose families could afford to pay for their return. The crisis had arrived exactly as Weber had predicted it might, without warning, without time for official responses, and in circumstances where conventional help would be too little, too late. Hailey's months of preparation were about to be tested against a real threat that would prove whether her caution had been wisdom or paranoia.
As Hailey watched Sarah Chen walk unknowingly toward the trap closing around her, she made one final attempt to work within official channels. Using her secure phone, she called the Vienna police emergency line, knowing even as she dialed that the conversation would demonstrate exactly why her unauthorized preparation had been necessary. "Emergency services? What is your emergency?" came the professional but routine response. "I'm witnessing what appears to be a coordinated surveillance operation targeting a university student," Hailey said, keeping her voice low while maintaining visual contact with the unfolding situation. "3 men are following a young woman into an isolated area of Prater Park. I believe they intend to abduct her." The pause that followed was telling. "Ma'am, are you certain this isn't just coincidental movement through the park? Has any actual crime been committed?" "They've been conducting systematic surveillance for over 3 hours," Hailey replied, watching as the operatives moved into final positioning. "They're using radio communication and coordinated movement patterns consistent with criminal operations. The target appears to be a wealthy international student." "Have you witnessed any assault, any direct threat, or any illegal activity?" the operator asked, following protocols designed for clear-cut situations rather than preventative intervention. "No direct assault yet, but—" "Ma'am, we cannot respond to suspicious behavior that hasn't resulted in criminal activity. If you witness an actual crime in progress, please call back immediately." The line went dead. Hailey stared at her phone, understanding that she'd just experienced the fundamental limitations of systems designed to respond to crimes rather than prevent them. By the time Sarah Chen was actually being attacked, it would be too late for any rescue operation to reach her. She tried Sarah's phone directly, but it went straight to voicemail. Either Sarah had turned it off for her study session, or the operatives had already begun signal jamming procedures. The academic environment that prized peaceful study and uninterrupted research had created perfect conditions for criminal operations to proceed undetected. The cultural context made everything worse. Vienna's reputation as a safe, civilized city meant that both citizens and authorities operated under assumptions of safety that made them slow to recognize or respond to actual threats. The same peaceful environment that made the city attractive to international students also made those students vulnerable to criminals who understood how to exploit systematic blind spots. Hailey watched as the university security protocols she'd studied revealed their fundamental limitations. Campus security was designed for routine problems like unauthorized access or minor disturbances, not for coordinated criminal operations conducted by professionals who understood how to avoid detection. The response procedures that worked for typical university incidents were completely inadequate for real threats. Even if Officer Hartman had believed her report, university security lacked the training, equipment, or authority to respond to kidnapping operations. Their protocols called for contacting police, who would require evidence of actual crime before responding, creating a circular system of referrals that would consume the critical minutes during which intervention was possible. The timing was deliberately calculated by the criminals. They'd studied the same systems she'd analyzed, but from the opposite perspective. Where she'd learned to identify vulnerabilities for protection, they'd identified them for exploitation. They understood exactly how long they had before anyone would notice Sarah Chen's absence, how the university's peaceful assumptions would delay recognition of the threat, and how the bureaucratic procedures would prevent rapid response. As Hailey watched Sarah Chen walking deeper into the isolated section of Prater Park, still unaware of the danger closing around her, Hailey understood that every system designed to protect students had failed. The emergency services couldn't act on threats that hadn't materialized into crimes. The university security couldn't respond to situations beyond their scope and jurisdiction. Her own credibility had been destroyed by the very preparation that made her capable of recognizing the threat. At 12:47 p.m., as the three operatives moved into final positioning around their target, Hailey accepted that she was the only person who could prevent what was about to happen. Every official channel had proven inadequate. Every authority had demonstrated the limitations that made her unauthorized preparation necessary. The system failure was complete. Sarah Chen was about to disappear into a criminal operation because the institutions responsible for student safety were structurally incapable of preventing crimes they couldn't officially acknowledge until after they had occurred.
Hailey stood at the edge of the tree line, watching the final pieces of the kidnapping operation fall into place, and felt the weight of everything she'd prepared for condensing into a single moment of decision. Sarah Chen was now completely isolated. The three operatives had positioned themselves to block her potential escape routes, and the window for intervention was measured in seconds rather than minutes. The choice before her was stark and irreversible. She could maintain her role as the quiet literature student who'd already been flagged by university administration as potentially unstable, walk away from the situation and hope that her reports to authorities would eventually lead to some form of response, or she could use every skill Weber had taught her, every piece of equipment she'd carefully accumulated, and every tactical principle she'd studied to prevent a fellow student from disappearing into a criminal network. But this wasn't just a choice between action and inaction. It was a choice between the person everyone expected her to be and the person she'd been secretly preparing to become. Everything she'd worked for at the university, her carefully maintained academic standing, her relationship with faculty and administration, her entire future as it had been planned, would be destroyed the moment she stepped out of the shadows and revealed the full extent of her capabilities. The weight of potential consequences pressed against her mind like a physical force. If she intervened and succeeded, she'd still face investigation for her unauthorized preparation and equipment. The modified backpack that contained defensive tools would be discovered and scrutinized. Her training with Weber would be exposed and questioned. Her months of tactical study and preparation would be reframed as evidence of dangerous obsession rather than prudent caution. If she intervened and failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. Not only would Sarah Chen be lost to the kidnapping operation, but Hailey herself would become a second victim. The operatives were clearly professionals who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses or complications. Her parents would receive notification that their daughter had been found dead in a Vienna park, apparently the victim of a random violent crime. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of the choice was the isolation it represented. She'd spent 2 years being told by everyone around her that her level of preparation was excessive, that her concerns for security were unfounded, that her careful planning represented psychological problems rather than practical wisdom. Now, in the moment when her preparation was most needed, she faced the choice completely alone. No one would thank her for this intervention. The authorities who dismissed her warnings would be embarrassed by her success. The university administration that had questioned her mental state would be forced to acknowledge that their problematic student had been the only person capable of preventing a serious crime. Her fellow students who'd seen her as antisocial and paranoid would have to confront the possibility that her isolation had been purposeful preparation rather than social dysfunction. Even Weber, who'd trained her for exactly this type of situation, had consistently emphasized that the goal of tactical preparation was to avoid confrontation, not to seek it. He'd taught her to recognize threats, plan responses, and develop capabilities while hoping she'd never need to use them. Choosing to intervene would mean crossing a line from preparation into action that would change her fundamentally and irreversibly. The cultural context made the choice even more complex. In a society that valued peaceful resolution and institutional authority, taking independent action against criminal threats could be viewed as vigilante behavior rather than heroic intervention. The same cultural assumptions that made Vienna feel safe also made direct action seem inappropriate, even when official channels had proven inadequate. Hailey thought about her parents, comfortable academics who'd sent their daughter to Vienna expecting her biggest challenges to involve maintaining good grades and choosing appropriate career paths. They'd been confused and concerned by the university's reports of her excessive security interests. How would they process news that their quiet, studious daughter had been involved in preventing a kidnapping operation using skills and equipment they'd never known she possessed? But as she watched Sarah Chen walking unknowingly toward the trap that was closing around her, Hailey realized that all of these considerations were ultimately irrelevant. The choice wasn't really between different versions of her future, but between action and the permanent knowledge that she'd possessed the capability to prevent a crime and chosen not to use it. Weber had taught her that tactical preparation carried moral responsibility. Skills create obligation, he'd said during one of their training sessions. If you develop capabilities to protect people, you become responsible for using them when protection is needed. The months of training, the careful accumulation of equipment, the study of defensive techniques, all of it had been leading to this moment when capability met necessity. At 12:51 p.m., as the lead operative began moving towards Sarah's position and the other two adjusted their positions to prevent her escape, Hailey made the choice that would transform her from someone who prepared for danger into someone who confronted it directly. She reached into her backpack and activated the equipment that university administrators had viewed as evidence of psychological problems, equipment that was about to prove the difference between Sarah Chen becoming another missing student statistic and walking safely home to call her parents in Hong Kong. The moment of choice was over. The moment of action was beginning.
Hailey moved through the park with the fluid precision of someone whose every action had been rehearsed dozens of times, though never under these exact circumstances. The 2 years of training with Weber had prepared her not just for individual techniques, but for the mental state required to function effectively when everything depended on her ability to execute under extreme pressure. Her first priority was repositioning to gain tactical advantage over the three operatives. They'd chosen their locations based on controlling Sarah's movement, which meant they'd positioned themselves in a formation that was optimized for capture rather than defense. Hailey used this against them, approaching from an angle that put her outside their planned containment area while giving her clear sightlines to all three positions. The modified backpack that had drawn so much suspicious attention from university administration now revealed its true purpose. From the concealed compartments, Hailey extracted equipment that looked innocuous individually but represented a comprehensive tactical response system. A tactical pen that could function as both writing instrument and defensive weapon. Cable ties disguised as hair accessories that could be used for restraint or emergency repairs. A water bottle with a false bottom containing communication equipment and defensive tools. Most importantly, she accessed the item that would have been impossible to explain if discovered during routine inspection, a compact tactical radio that could monitor and disrupt the communication frequencies being used by the operatives. Weber had taught her that communication disruption was often more effective than direct confrontation, especially when facing multiple coordinated opponents. Hailey positioned herself behind a cluster of trees that provided concealment while maintaining visual contact with the developing situation. From her backpack, she extracted a small directional antenna and began scanning for the radio frequencies the operatives were using to coordinate their movements. Within 90 seconds, she'd identified their primary communication channel and begun monitoring their tactical coordination. The conversations she intercepted confirmed her worst assessment of the situation. This wasn't an opportunistic crime, but a carefully planned operation conducted by professionals who'd been surveilling university students for weeks. Sarah Chen wasn't their only target. She was simply the first to be isolated in circumstances that allowed for safe extraction. But Hailey's monitoring also revealed critical information about their operational procedures. The team was working to a strict timeline that required them to complete the abduction and clear the area within a specific window. They had extraction vehicles positioned at predetermined locations, backup personnel monitoring for police response, and contingency plans for various complications.
What they didn't have was preparation for interference from someone with tactical training who'd been observing their operation from the beginning. Their communications reflected confidence that they were operating in a predictable environment against untrained targets with no defensive capabilities. Hailey used this overconfidence against them. While they focused on controlling Sarah's movement through the park, she began systematically disrupting their operational coordination. Using techniques Weber had taught her for electronic warfare, she began introducing interference into their radio communications, creating gaps and distortions that would make coordination increasingly difficult. The effect was immediate and exactly what she'd hoped for. The operatives began experiencing communication failures at critical moments, forcing them to rely on visual signals and predetermined procedures rather than real-time coordination. Their formation, which had been fluid and responsive, became rigid and predictable as they compensated for the loss of reliable communication. With their coordination disrupted, Hailey moved to the second phase of her intervention. From her concealed position, she began documenting the operation using the recording equipment hidden in her tactical pen. If this situation escalated to the point where she needed to involve law enforcement, having clear evidence of the criminal activity would be essential for ensuring appropriate response. But documentation alone wouldn't save Sarah Chen, who was now less than 50 meters from the position where the lead operative waited to initiate contact. Hailey needed to create sufficient disruption to either alert Sarah to the danger or force the operatives to abort their mission entirely. The solution came from an unexpected source: her literature studies. One of her recent papers had analyzed how authors used environmental elements to create tension and misdirection in narrative structure. Now she applied those same principles to tactical misdirection, using the park environment to create false indicators that would confuse the operatives about the source of interference. Hailey began a systematic campaign of subtle disruption, designed to make the operatives question their operational security. She activated small noisemakers at strategic locations that suggested the presence of additional personnel monitoring their activities. She used reflective surfaces to create false visual signals that implied surveillance from multiple positions. Most effectively, she began simulating radio traffic that suggested their operation had been detected by law enforcement. The psychological effect was more powerful than direct confrontation would have been. Professional criminals were trained to handle resistance from targets, but they were extremely sensitive to indicators that their operations had been compromised by authorities. The suggestion that they were operating under surveillance created exactly the kind of uncertainty that made continuation of their mission unacceptably risky. By 1:03 p.m., the disruption had created sufficient confusion that the operatives began questioning whether to proceed with the abduction. Their communications, when Hailey allowed them to function clearly, reflected growing concern about operational security and discussion of abort procedures. But she knew that disruption alone might not be sufficient to ensure Sarah Chen's safety. Professional criminal operations included contingency plans for various complications, and the operatives might decide to proceed with a modified approach rather than abort entirely. As Sarah Chen continued walking toward the position where interception was planned, Hailey prepared to transition from disruption to direct intervention. She'd used her tactical advantages to create confusion and delay, but the ultimate success of her unauthorized operation would depend on her ability to prevent the abduction through whatever means proved necessary. The solitary journey that had begun with careful observation and systematic preparation was about to reach its conclusion. In the next few minutes, she would discover whether her months of training and equipment preparation had been adequate for protecting someone whose safety depended entirely on her willingness to act when official systems had failed.
At 1:04 p.m., when the lead operative decided to proceed despite the communication disruptions and moved directly towards Sarah Chen's position, Hailey transitioned from covert disruption to active intervention. Every skill Weber had drilled into her during 2 years of intensive training crystallized into a sequence of actions that would have shocked everyone who knew her as the quiet literature student. The first challenge was alerting Sarah without compromising her own tactical position or triggering immediate violent response from the operatives. Hailey used a technique Weber had taught her for emergency communication in hostile environments. From her concealed position, she activated a high-frequency alert tone on her tactical radio, directing it toward Sarah's location using the directional antenna. The sound was designed to cut through background noise and trigger immediate attention without being obviously artificial. Sarah stopped walking and looked around, momentarily confused but clearly aware that something had changed in her environment. The alert created exactly the pause Hailey needed to begin the next phase of her intervention. With Sarah's movement halted, Hailey began systematic disruption of the operative's positioning. Using her knowledge of the park layout that she'd studied obsessively during her preparation, she began creating controlled distractions that forced each operative to reassess their positions. A carefully thrown object that suggested movement in an unexpected direction. Reflected light from a tactical mirror that implied observation from multiple positions. Electronic interference that made their radio coordination increasingly unreliable. But the operatives were professionals who recognized that their mission was being actively opposed. At 1:06 p.m., the team leader made the decision to accelerate their timeline and proceed with direct approach despite the complications. This forced Hailey to abandon covert tactics and move to direct confrontation. From her backpack, she extracted the items that would have been impossible to explain during university security inspections. A tactical flashlight capable of producing disorienting strobing effects. Restraint devices disguised as innocent accessories. Most importantly, defensive tools that looked like standard student supplies but had been modified for tactical applications. The lead operative approached Sarah Chen using standard predatory techniques designed to appear non-threatening while establishing control. He began with casual conversation about directions, gradually moving closer and attempting to isolate her from potential witnesses or escape routes. But Hailey's earlier disruptions had made him nervous, and his approach was less smooth than it would have been under normal circumstances. Hailey used this uncertainty against him. From her position 30 meters away, she began creating the impression of law enforcement presence using techniques Weber had taught her for emergency signaling. Specific light patterns that suggested police surveillance, electronic signals that mimicked law enforcement radio traffic. Most effectively, she began broadcasting on frequencies commonly used by Vienna police, creating false traffic that suggested the area was under active monitoring. The psychological effect was immediate. Professional criminal operations depend on being able to assess and control their environment. The suggestion that law enforcement was actively monitoring the area made continuation of the mission extremely high risk. The operative began backing away from Sarah, clearly reassessing the situation. But Hailey knew that creating doubt wasn't the same as ensuring safety. The operatives might withdraw temporarily, only to resume surveillance and attempt the abduction at a later time when they felt more secure. She needed to create sufficient disruption to force them to abandon not just this attempt, but their entire operation targeting university students. At 1:09 p.m., she made the decision to transition from defensive to offensive action. Using movement techniques that would have amazed her literature professors and university counselors, Hailey began systematically approaching each operative position while maintaining concealment and tactical advantage. Her first target was the communication specialist who'd been coordinating the team's activities from a position near the park's main path. Hailey approached using cover and concealment techniques that made her nearly invisible until she was close enough to act directly. When she disabled his radio equipment using tools from her modified backpack, the operative found himself suddenly isolated and unable to coordinate with his team members. The second operative, positioned to block Sarah's potential escape route, became aware that something was seriously wrong when his communication equipment failed and he couldn't raise his team leader. But by the time he recognized the threat, Hailey had already moved to a position that gave her tactical advantage. Using restraint techniques Weber had drilled into her, she neutralized him as a threat without creating the kind of disturbance that would attract unwanted attention. The team leader, realizing that his operation was being systematically dismantled by an opponent he couldn't identify or locate, made the decision that Hailey had been working toward: complete mission abort. But she couldn't allow him to simply withdraw and reorganize for another attempt. She needed to ensure that the criminal network understood that targeting university students in Vienna had become unacceptably dangerous.
Using her tactical radio, Hailey began broadcasting detailed information about the abduction operation to Vienna police frequencies, providing locations, descriptions, and evidence that would make it impossible for the operatives to simply disappear and resume their activities elsewhere. She documented enough of their procedures and equipment to ensure that law enforcement would be able to identify and track the criminal network.
The Vienna police response was swift and decisive. Within 20 minutes of Hailey's anonymous radio broadcasts, tactical units had surrounded Prater Park and apprehended 2 of the 3 operatives. The evidence she'd provided was so detailed and accurate that law enforcement immediately understood they were dealing with a professional criminal operation that had been under sophisticated surveillance by someone with advanced tactical knowledge. Detective Inspector Klaus Richter, who'd been investigating a series of missing person cases involving international students, found himself staring at radio transcripts and photographic evidence that solved several ongoing investigations in a single afternoon. The operational details, equipment descriptions, and tactical analysis provided by the anonymous informant demonstrated knowledge that exceeded anything his department had been able to develop through months of conventional investigation. Whoever provided this intelligence has tactical training equivalent to our specialized units, Richter told his team as they reviewed the evidence. The level of operational analysis, the quality of documentation, and the precision of the intervention suggest either law enforcement or military experience. But according to our records, no such operation was authorized or conducted by any official agency. Sarah Chen walked home that evening completely unaware that she'd been the target of a kidnapping operation, or that a fellow student had spent her afternoon preventing her disappearance. She'd noticed some unusual activity in the park, police sirens and helicopters, but Vienna was a major city where such things occasionally happened. She called her parents in Hong Kong, as she did every Tuesday, chatting about her literature courses and plans for the upcoming semester break. The first indication that anything extraordinary had occurred came when university security contacted students the following morning with warnings about suspicious activity in the area. The notice was routine, the kind of security update that students typically ignored, but it mentioned that police had arrested suspects in connection with an attempted abduction operation targeting university students. Hailey read the security notice with satisfaction while sitting in the same library alcove where she'd first noticed the surveillance operation 24 hours earlier. The official report credited alert citizens and effective police response for preventing the crime, making no mention of the tactical intervention that had actually disrupted the operation. She preferred it that way. But the investigation was far from over. Detective Richter's team had quickly identified the captured operatives as part of an international criminal network that specialized in kidnapping wealthy students for ransom. The evidence provided by their anonymous informant had broken open a case that spanned multiple countries and had resulted in at least 12 disappearances over the previous 18 months. The problem was that the quality of intelligence and tactical analysis suggested the informant had capabilities that couldn't be easily explained. The radio equipment used for the broadcasts was military grade. The surveillance techniques demonstrated in the documentation were sophisticated enough to require specialized training. Most puzzling, the intervention itself had been executed with precision that suggested extensive tactical preparation. "We need to identify our informant," Richter told his superior during the case briefing. "This level of capability doesn't appear spontaneously. Someone with significant training and equipment conducted a solo operation that our entire specialized unit would have had difficulty executing under similar circumstances." The search for the mysterious informant led inevitably to the university. The criminals had been targeting students, the operation had been detected during library research hours, and the tactical response had demonstrated intimate knowledge of campus and city geography. Someone connected to the university had been prepared for exactly this type of threat. University administration found themselves in an awkward position when police began investigating students and staff who might have tactical knowledge and equipment. The inquiry quickly focused on individuals who demonstrated unusual security awareness or who'd requested access to information beyond their normal academic requirements.
Officer Hartman, who dismissed Hailey's warnings as evidence of psychological problems, found himself reviewing his interactions with students who'd expressed security concerns. His reports about problematic student behavior suddenly appeared in a different light when investigators were looking for someone with exactly the kind of tactical awareness he'd been documenting as concerning. Dr. Schneider was even more uncomfortable when investigators asked about students who demonstrated excessive preparation or unusual knowledge of security procedures. The characteristics that had made Hailey seem like a problem student were precisely the qualities that would enable someone to conduct the kind of operation that had saved Sarah Chen. The connection became undeniable when investigators reviewed campus security footage from the morning of the incident. Cameras had captured Hailey leaving the dormitory at her usual early hour, entering the library during the time frame when surveillance was first detected, and exiting shortly before the operation began. Her movement patterns matched the timeline perfectly. But what convinced investigators they'd found their anonymous informant was the discovery of Hailey's academic work. Her literature essays, which had troubled faculty for their focus on tactical themes, suddenly read like the work of someone with advanced knowledge of security operations. Her research requests, which had seemed inappropriately broad, indicated exactly the kind of systematic preparation that would enable tactical intervention. When Detective Richter knocked on Hailey's dormitory door at 8 a.m. on Thursday morning, she wasn't surprised. She'd been expecting this conversation since the moment she decided to intervene. The only question was whether she'd be treated as a suspect or as the person who prevented a serious crime. "Miss Williams," Richter said, showing his identification, "I'd like to discuss your activities on Tuesday afternoon, specifically your presence in Prater Park during the time when a criminal operation was disrupted by someone with tactical training very similar to what you appear to possess." Hailey looked at the detective, then at Officer Hartman and Dr. Schneider, who'd accompanied him, and realized that everything she'd worked to keep hidden was about to be revealed. The quiet literature student who'd been viewed as a security concern was about to be recognized as someone whose excessive preparation had prevented a kidnapping and broken up an international criminal network. She invited them into her room and began explaining exactly how someone who looked like any college student could carry military-grade equipment and execute tactical operations that professional law enforcement found impressive.
6 months after the Prater Park incident, Hailey Williams stood in a lecture hall that was markedly different from the literature seminars that had defined her university experience. The audience consisted of Vienna police tactical officers, university security personnel, and private security consultants, all gathered to hear the presentation that had been requested by every law enforcement agency in Austria. The title displayed on the screen behind her read, "Civilian Tactical Preparation: Bridging the Gap Between Individual Capability and Institutional Response." Hailey had transitioned from literature student to recognized expert in personal security and threat assessment, a transformation that still amazed everyone who'd known her as the quiet academic with concerning behavioral patterns. Detective Richter, who'd become her primary contact with law enforcement, introduced her to the assembled professionals. Ms. Williams' intervention last October prevented a kidnapping, dismantled an international criminal network, and provided intelligence that solved 12 missing person cases across 3 countries. More importantly, her preparation methods offer insights into civilian capability development that our agencies need to understand and integrate. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The same tactical knowledge that had made university administrators question Hailey's mental state was now being studied as a model for enhancing public safety through individual preparation. Her modified equipment designs were being evaluated for adoption by professional security teams. Her threat assessment protocols were being integrated into training programs for law enforcement officers. Dr. Schneider, who now served as the university's liaison for security affairs, had undergone perhaps the most dramatic shift in perspective. During the introduction, she explained how the institution had learned from its initial response to Hailey's preparation. "We now recognize that exceptional individual capability should be cultivated rather than discouraged. Ms. Williams' dedication to security awareness has led to comprehensive improvements in our student safety protocols." The university had indeed changed its approach dramatically.
Students were now encouraged to develop personal security skills. The campus security office offered training programs in situational awareness and threat recognition. Most significantly, the administration had established a student advisory panel for security issues, with Hailey serving as its founding chair. But perhaps the most meaningful change was represented by Sarah Chen, who sat in the front row of the lecture hall. 6 months earlier, she'd been an unknowing target of a criminal operation. Now she was one of Hailey's most dedicated students in the personal security training program that had grown from their shared experience. Sarah had no memory of how close she'd come to disappearing, but she understood completely why preparation for unlikely threats was essential. The lesson of last October, Hailey told the assembled professionals, isn't that everyone should develop tactical capabilities. It's that institutional assumptions about threat probability can create dangerous blind spots. When official systems assume certain threats are unlikely, they become structurally incapable of recognizing or responding to those threats when they actually occur. Officer Hartman, who'd initially dismissed her warnings as evidence of psychological problems, now worked closely with Hailey to develop protocols for evaluating civilian security reports. His experience had taught him the difference between paranoid concerns and legitimate threat assessment. Ms. Williams taught us that what looks like excessive preparation might actually be appropriate response to threats we're not trained to recognize, he told the audience. Weber, her tactical instructor, had watched her transformation with professional pride and personal amazement. The quiet literature student who'd enrolled in basic self-defense classes had become someone whose tactical innovations were being studied by law enforcement agencies across Europe. Hailey represents what's possible when individual dedication meets systematic preparation. She didn't just develop skills, she developed a comprehensive approach to personal security that proved superior to official methods when real threats emerged. The presentation included details that would have shocked her former literature professors: tactical equipment integration methods, threat recognition protocols, communication systems design, intelligence gathering techniques, all delivered by someone who still maintained her academic standing and continued writing thoughtful analyses of Victorian literature. But the most significant aspect of Hailey's new reality was the validation it provided for principles she'd always believed. Individual preparation for unlikely threats wasn't paranoid, it was prudent. Systematic skill development wasn't obsessive, it was responsible. Questioning official assumptions about safety wasn't problematic, it was necessary. As she concluded her presentation, Hailey addressed the broader implications of her experience. The criminal operation that targeted Sarah Chen and other students succeeded in multiple countries before reaching Vienna. It failed here, not because our official systems were superior, but because one person refused to accept that adequate preparation was excessive. The question for all security professionals is how to encourage that kind of individual capability while supporting it with institutional resources. The response was immediate and comprehensive. Law enforcement agencies requested consultation on civilian integration protocols. Universities asked for guidance on encouraging student security awareness without creating alarm. Private security companies sought to understand how individual preparation could enhance their professional services. Hailey's transformation was complete, but it represented something larger than personal success. She'd proven that the qualities institutions often view as problematic, excessive preparation, systematic thinking, refusal to accept comfortable assumptions, might actually be exactly what's needed to address threats that official systems are structured to miss. 6 months after being questioned about her mental state for carrying tactical equipment, Hailey Williams was being paid to teach law enforcement officers how to develop the same capabilities. The quiet literature student who'd been told to focus on conventional academic activities was now recognized as an expert whose unconventional preparation had saved lives and disrupted international criminal operations. The literature student who'd looked like any college student until kidnappers discovered her backpack contained military-grade weapons had become proof that sometimes the most unlikely people are exactly the ones society needs most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.